A Buy Canadian movement is sweeping the nation. Made in Canada labels are now front and center in grocery and liquor stores. And the trend is moving into malls and clothing shops.
For the first time in more than 50 years, Canada is cutting key auto ties with the United States. And this may become the most dangerous rupture in the North American supply chain since 1965. For decades, the North American auto system functioned like a single organism. Parts crossed the border from Ontario, Michigan, Indiana, and Quebec every single day without hesitation, without politics, and without fear. But today, that foundation is cracking. Canada's decision to step back from long-standing auto cooperation with the United States is not an emotional outburst. It is the result of years of rising tariffs, shrinking trust, and a growing belief inside Canada that dependence has quietly turned into vulnerability. In this report, we will examine why Canada made this move now, why Canadian consumers are increasingly joining a boycott against United States products and tourism, and why major auto companies are suddenly shifting production away from Ontario in a way the region has not seen in generations. Most importantly, we will ask a difficult question. Is this simply a policy adjustment, or is this the first sign that the North American trade order is beginning to unravel? Stay with us until the end, because there is a major strategic secret behind this break that will change how you understand the future of both countries. The escalation begins. The turning point did not come from a new tariff, a corporate announcement, or a quiet policy revision. It erupted the moment the President of the United States stood before reporters in early 2025 and declared that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States. It was a sentence delivered almost casually, but its impact hit Ottawa like an earthquake. For millions of Canadians, it was not a joke, not a diplomatic misfire, but a fundamental insult to national sovereignty. The anger that followed was immediate, widespread, and impossible to ignore. That remark collided with an already fragile backdrop. The United States had been tightening auto-related duties under the revived America First doctrine, treating Canadian components as foreign liabilities rather than integrated partners. Canada, after decades of cooperation, suddenly found itself framed as an outsider in a system it had helped build. The president's statement was not the cause of the break, but it was the spark that ignited long, simmering frustration. Canadians felt belittled. Policymakers felt cornered. And businesses sensed the wind shifting decisively. Within weeks, the Canadian government began recalibrating its auto posture. Access for United States automakers was no longer automatic. Ottawa demanded verifiable domestic investment, binding commitments to Canadian workers, and stricter inspections for rules of origin. Industry insiders had warned for years that Canadian patience was not infinite. Now, that patience had ended. The economic consequences mounted quickly. In Ontario, long considered the beating heart of Canada's auto production, companies faced difficult decisions. Stellantis redirected significant production from Ontario to Illinois, costing thousands of jobs. General Motors halted electric van manufacturing in Ingersoll, eliminating entire shifts and sending shockwaves through local supply chains. Towns like Windsor and Brampton, already navigating a fragile recovery, watched their economic lifelines fray. Across the border, factories in the Midwest began experiencing ripple effects of their own. Delivery times for Canadian parts increased, costs climbed, assembly lines slowed. What had once been the most reliable cross-border supply relationship in the world was now drifting into uncertainty. But this is only the beginning. The deeper impact is not in the immediate losses, but in the structural shift that will reshape North American industry for an entire generation. And there is an even more explosive development ahead, one that explains why both countries are now bracing for a far more profound economic fracture than anyone expected. The immediate shock inside Canada was not only emotional, but brutally economic. Canada's auto sector employs roughly 135,000 direct workers and more than 400,000 indirect workers, according to the Canadian Automotive Partnership Council. For decades, this workforce depended on the stability of a cross-border production model where Canadian and United States factories operated as extensions of one another. But once tariffs tightened and trust eroded, that model began to unravel. When Stellantis redirected production from Ontario to Illinois, the impact was instant. Thousands of workers faced layoffs, suppliers across southern Ontario saw contracts paused or canceled, and regional forecasts warned that local economic output in Windsor could decline by nearly 1% during 2025. General Motors' decision to end electric van production in Ingersoll deepened the blow, removing more than 1,000 direct jobs and thousands more up and down the Ontario parts ecosystem. The loss of these manufacturing lines did more than reduce employment. It shook the long-held assumption that Canada would always be treated as the primary secondary production hub of North America. For many communities, this was the first time they realized that United States corporate commitments were no longer guaranteed. The president's controversial statement suggesting that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States only intensified this sentiment. Across Canada, households and businesses interpreted the words not as diplomatic clumsiness, but as confirmation that political considerations in Washington now overshadowed long-term industrial cooperation. Consumers reacted as well. Vehicle prices climbed across the country as tariffs on key components raised costs. Logistics disruptions caused inventory shortages. Canadian dealerships reported higher wait times for parts, longer repair periods, and higher maintenance bills. The economic strain spread from factories to families. For many Canadians, it was the first concrete evidence that the relationship with the United States had shifted from partnership to fragile dependency. Amid this instability, the federal government in Ottawa accelerated its strategy to rebuild domestic resilience. The 2025 Industrial Strength Plan prioritized Canadian-based battery production, electric vehicle incentives, and long-term investment in critical minerals. Canada announced 26 new mineral partnerships with 9 allied countries, including members of the European Union and major Asian economies. This was not isolationism. It was a structural correction designed to prevent a single foreign policy decision in Washington from placing an entire national industry at risk. But while Canada was working to stabilize itself, the shockwaves south of the border were only beginning to appear. For the United States, the consequences were quieter at first, but no less significant. The Midwest, the historic center of American auto manufacturing, depends heavily on Canadian components. Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana rely on cross-border supply chains for everything from transmissions to semi-finished battery modules. When Canada began limiting tariff-free access and enforcing stricter rules of origin, the effect on the United States manufacturing timeline was immediate. The Bureau of Transportation Statistics recorded an 18% increase in cross-border delivery times during 2025. Assembly lines that once relied on predictable flows now faced delays that disrupted planning, increased idle time, and raised operational costs. Analysts at the United States Chamber of Commerce warned that prolonged friction with Canada could result in more than 40,000 lost jobs across the Midwest if unaddressed. Consumers inside the United States felt the impact as well. The Cox Automotive Price Index projected vehicle price increases between 3% and 7% across 2025, driven by higher input costs, more expensive logistics, and shifting North American supply routes. Ironically, the tariffs designed to protect American jobs instead increased expenses for American families, weakening purchasing power at a time when inflation remained a top concern. The geopolitical fallout was just as serious. Canada's pursuit of new auto and energy partnerships with Europe and Asia created a vacuum in areas where the United States had traditionally maintained dominance. The launch of the Canada-European Union Industrial Policy Dialogue in July 2025 symbolized this shift. Canada was no longer assuming the United States would remain the automatic first partner in industrial strategy. Instead, Ottawa was building a multi-partner network designed to reduce vulnerability and diversify risk. Meanwhile, the Canadian public's boycott of the United States was gaining momentum. Car travel from Canada into the United States dropped by approximately 35% in September 2025 compared with the previous year. In several provinces, American-made spirits were removed from government-run liquor stores, leading to an 80% collapse in sales in Ontario alone. Major banks reported that Canadian credit card spending inside the United States had fallen by double digits. To Washington, these numbers may have looked like minor fluctuations. To Ottawa, they represented a turning point. The trust that once powered the North American economic engine was dissolving from the ground up. And yet, all of this is only a fraction of the full story. The most consequential shift, the one capable of permanently reshaping the future of North American industry, is still ahead. Inside Washington, the unraveling of auto cooperation with Canada has been far more uncomfortable than officials initially admitted. For many years, policymakers in the United States assumed that the economic relationship with Canada was self-sustaining, stable, and unbreakable. The two countries were North America's industrial backbone. The idea of separation was almost unthinkable. But the consequences of rising tariffs, rising political tension, and the president's controversial 51st state remark revealed something Washington had not expected. Leverage that once worked automatically no longer works at all. American automakers have felt this loss of leverage first. Canadian components remain essential to countless production lines in Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. When Canada tightened tariff-free access and enforced stricter proof of domestic investment, the move struck directly at the heart of the United States auto supply chain. Assembly plants began reporting shortages in wiring harnesses, electronic modules, nickel-based battery inputs, and precision-machined parts that had long been sourced reliably from Canada. The United States Chamber of Commerce issued one of its strongest warnings in years, stating that disruptions in Canadian inputs could lead to more than 40,000 job losses across the Midwest if the current pattern continues. The American Automotive Policy Council added that no alternative supplier can immediately match Canada's quality, regulatory compatibility, and cross-border efficiency. For consumers inside the United States, the impact broadened quickly. Vehicle prices increased across multiple categories, according to the Cox Automotive Price Index. Repair costs rose as dealerships struggled to source parts that had always been available on short notice. Even rental car agencies reported reduced fleet availability, particularly in states bordering Canada. There is also a political cost. Canada's decision to reshape its industrial policy without deferring to United States preferences challenged a long-standing belief in Washington that the United States, as the larger economy, would always dictate the pace of cooperation. Instead, Ottawa demonstrated that it was fully willing to act independently if provoked, and that public anger inside Canada, especially after the 51st state comment, had shifted permanently toward a more assertive posture. This leaves the United States confronting a reality it has not faced in decades. The assumptions underpinning the North American auto ecosystem no longer hold. The idea that Canada would always fall in line has collapsed. And Washington now finds itself navigating a partnership that has become more conditional, more fragile, and far less predictable. As friction with the United States intensified, Canada moved rapidly to re-anchor itself within a wider network of global partners. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a structural pivot with long-term implications for the global auto and energy landscape. The Canada-European Union Industrial Policy Dialogue, announced in July 2025, established a coordinated framework for joint production of batteries, minerals, and clean energy technologies. For the first time, Canada openly framed Europe as a primary industrial partner rather than a secondary one. In the months that followed, European companies expanded investments in Canadian battery manufacturing, mineral refining, and electric vehicle supply chains. In Asia, Canada's partnerships deepened even further. South Korea and Japan, both global leaders in electric vehicle technology, accelerated their cooperation with Ottawa. Canada's supply of nickel, cobalt, and rare earth materials became strategically valuable as Asian automakers sought reliable sources outside China. Government documents highlighted 26 new critical mineral agreements with 9 allied nations. The message was unmistakable. Canada would never again rely on a single market for industrial security. Meanwhile, China, the world's largest electric vehicle producer, closely monitored the North American rift. Analysts noted that weakening cooperation between Canada and the United States could inadvertently create openings for China to expand its influence in global battery manufacturing and mineral processing, markets it already dominates. If the North American system becomes fragmented, Chinese firms could gain competitive advantages simply by maintaining unified production lines at scale. Mexico also emerged as a quiet beneficiary. With tensions rising between Canada and the United States, several companies began exploring relocation options inside Mexico, where labor costs are lower and United States market access remains advantageous. This shift hinted at a deeper trend. The traditional North American triangle is being reshaped, and Mexico may become the new industrial bridge between two increasingly distant northern neighbors. Canada's internal recalibration further accelerated the global realignment. The federal government's 2025 plan emphasized national resilience, reshoring, and diversification into clean technology. These efforts were reinforced by political messaging from Prime Minister Mark Carney and Minister Mélanie Joly, whose repeated statements underscored a central theme. Cooperation with the United States would continue only when it delivered stability, mutual respect, and predictability. The global context makes this transformation even more significant. Reliability has become the most valuable currency in global trade. Nations are prioritizing partners who offer consistency rather than size. By distancing itself from the unpredictable swings of United States tariff policy and political rhetoric, Canada is signaling to the world that it intends to operate on firmer ground. And yet, even with new partnerships, new investments, and new global alignments, the unanswered question remains. What happens when two countries that built the most integrated industrial system on Earth begin to drift apart? That is where the next phase of this crisis begins, and where the long-term strategic consequences become impossible to ignore. The long-term risks of the Canada-United States auto rupture extend far beyond lost production lines or short-term political tension. What is unfolding now is a structural break in the deepest, most interdependent manufacturing system on the continent. If this shift continues, analysts warn that total North American auto efficiency could decline by nearly 12%, driven by longer delivery routes, mismatched standards, duplicated investments, and rising cost structures. For Canada, the vulnerabilities are real. The country still relies on the United States to absorb more than 70% of all auto exports. If the industrial split accelerates faster than domestic adjustment, Canada could face 15,000 to 20,000 additional job losses over the next 2 years. This risk grows if companies redirect even a small portion of assembly to the United States or Mexico, where some production incentives remain more aggressive. There is also a political risk inside Canada. The president's remark suggesting that Canada should become the 51st state of the United States has permanently reshaped public opinion. Many Canadians now believe that the United States does not treat their country as an equal partner. If this sentiment hardens, future Canadian governments may face strong public pressure to further distance the nation from United States economic influence. That shift, if sustained, could lead to deeper trade diversification, but also reduced leverage inside North America. For the United States, the risks are equally severe. Losing seamless access to Canadian components could force American automakers to restructure entire supply chains at enormous cost. Every additional day of delivery delay triggers higher inventory overhead, increases wage inefficiencies, and raises final vehicle prices. Analysts estimate that sustained friction with Canada could remove tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs from the Midwest, the region most dependent on cross-border inputs. The strategic risk is even clearer. By allowing tariff disputes and political rhetoric to undermine trust, the United States is weakening its own industrial perimeter. A fragmented North American auto sector gives competitors, particularly China and the European Union, an opening to expand their influence in global electric vehicle markets. In the long run, the cost of this political miscalculation could be measured not only in lost jobs, but also in lost global leadership. Even amid the instability, opportunities are emerging that could reshape the economic future of Canada and the United States if both countries act deliberately and strategically. For Canada, the shift is forcing a long overdue transformation. Ottawa's 2025 industrial plan emphasizes battery production, critical minerals, electric vehicle technology, and strategic partnerships with Europe and Asia. Instead of relying overwhelmingly on a single market, Canada is building a diversified industrial base that can endure political shocks. The 26 new mineral agreements with 9 allied nations represent an ambitious attempt to become a global supplier of clean energy resources, a role the world urgently needs. Canada's domestic investments also have the potential to create a new wave of jobs in mining, refining, clean energy, and advanced manufacturing. By anchoring more of the value chain inside the country, Canada is positioning itself not as a junior partner in North America, but as a sovereign industrial force with multiple economic lifelines. For the United States, there are also real opportunities if Washington adjusts course. Reduced reliance on Canadian components, paired with targeted incentives, could allow the United States to rebuild parts of its auto sector that had gradually shifted northward. But this will require a more predictable trade posture and a willingness to treat Canada as a strategic equal rather than an automatic subordinate. There is a path where both countries emerge stronger. A modernized North American auto model with clearer commitments, shared standards, coordinated mineral access, and transparent investment rules. But that outcome is not guaranteed. It depends on political discipline, something that has been in short supply on both sides of the border. What is certain is this: the old system cannot continue as it once did. The fracture has happened. The question now is how deep it will go. And the answer becomes clear only when we confront the final, unavoidable question: what does this rupture mean for the future of the entire North American economic order? The rupture between Canada and the United States is no longer a temporary disagreement or a narrow dispute inside the auto sector. It has become a structural turning point that is reshaping the foundations of the entire North American economy. The trust that once held the system together, from integrated factories to cross-border labor networks to decades of predictable trade, has been weakened by tariffs, political shocks, and a level of public anger that neither government can fully reverse overnight. Canada is moving toward a more diversified, self-reliant industrial model. The United States is grappling with rising costs, slowing production, and a loss of the automatic leverage it once held. And across the global market, competitors are already adjusting their strategies to exploit the widening gap between two countries that once operated as a unified economic engine. The real question now is simple but vital. Is this a bold strategy or a risky mistake for the United States? Will Washington adapt to a new reality, or will it allow a quiet break to become a permanent fracture? For viewers who want clear, fact-driven reporting on global trade shifts, supply chains, and the future of North American power, subscribe for more fact-based global analysis.